Hey everyone. Quick correction from last week's video. Last week when I was going through all the movie release stuff, most of the mistakes that might be in that video are because Box Office Mojo wasn't completely updated, like the Spider-Man release was moved from November to December, that kind of thing. But the one mistake I made personally, that I should have known better, and my friend Andrew ended up correcting me on it, was that Nomadland, after its 2-week exclusive IMAX run, wasn't going to be exclusive to theaters. It was dropping day and date on Hulu. Nomadland, released by Searchlight Pictures, used to be called Fox Searchlight, owned by Disney now. Hulu, Disney is still sort of the main owner of Hulu, because after they bought Fox, they got the ABC share, because ABC is owned by Disney, and then they owned some of Fox, because with the exception of like Fox News and Fox Sports, Disney owns almost all of what used to be Fox now, with News Corp caping some of the other stuff. So they dropped Nomadland on Hulu last Friday, along with its normal theatrical release. I ended up watching it on Hulu and not in theaters, and the main reason was because when I saw the trailers for Nomadland, I was getting some like Terrence Malick vibes that maybe it would be like a little boring and that there'd be lots of pretty shots of nature vistas, but that it would just kind of be a slog to get through, like most of Terrence Malick's stuff from Thin Red Line onward. I do like Tree of Life quite a lot, but the rest of his stuff I'm not big on. Of his, 98 and to present stuff. His 70 stuff is different. But to my surprise, Nomadland is an excellent film. It's extremely depressing. It will leave like a chasm in your heart. Not something to watch if you're not in a good mood. But it's this excellent film that's really just about the failure of the United States, American exceptionalism, and American capitalism, and the lack of our social safety net and how it abandons people. But a really very strong movie, and I highly recommend it. So if you're reticent about seeing it in the theater, I'd say go ahead and do so. But otherwise, I watched it on Hulu and loved it quite a bit. Moving on. So there was some big news this week. The one that probably got the most air out of the room was the New York City stuff, that New York City is going to allow theaters to reopen at about 20% capacity or 50 people in an auditorium maximum, whichever is lower. I'm not sure with New York City rents on property whether the theaters can still afford to open at those capacity restrictions, but this is the first time theaters within New York City are going to be open since they first closed down in March, so it's sort of big on that scale. I mean, people who live in New York City, if they really wanted to go to the theater, I think there was some stuff that was open in upstate New York, or they would just go across the tunnel to New Jersey to see films. But New York City and Los Angeles, which is also closed right now, but may start to reopen because there's some rumblings in the state of California about their closures. They're trying to recall their governor, and some of the people want like Disneyland to reopen and stuff, so they might open up theaters in Los Angeles County. But New York City and Los Angeles County are a huge bite of the market, and the theater industry doesn't really have a chance of getting anywhere close to back to normal until those two markets are open in some way. So if New York City is reopening in March, albeit with the small restrictions, and if Los Angeles County ends up opening in a similar manner, then we might be back on the road to recovery, albeit still very slow as the vaccine rollout goes on. Now, the big story that I don't think got as much attention as it should have has to do with some of the news announcements that came out about Paramount+. Rolling back a little bit, Viacom is this parent company. Viacom owns CBS, and they also own Paramount Picture Studios. CBS is what they ended up branding their streaming service from. They called it CBS All Access. CBS All Access kind of sucked, to be honest. I had like a free 30-day subscription that I used to watch Picard, and then I canceled it because CBS All Access was pretty much the streaming service where you went if you wanted to see Gene Roddenberry roll in his grave at how desecrated Star Trek is becoming under Alex Kurtzman. But aside from that, they had like CBS network shows, but I'm not sure if it still has the stigma now as it did when I was a teenager, but CBS has always been seen as like the old person network, and not just because of 60 Minutes, but because of their like very boilerplate, not very creative police procedural kind of shows, your NCIS and that kind of stuff. They were always seen as just sort of like they're not doing anything exciting. They're just like old people network shows to watch. So branding it as CBS for the Viacom library probably wasn't the best thing, and they finally realized it. So now they're going to call it Paramount Plus. They're going to create like new movies for it that people might actually be interested in seeing. But the biggest announcement as far as the theatrical experience goes is they announced what their release or theatrical exclusivity window is going to be. Now, they only announced this for 2 movies that they have slated for the fall right now. They didn't announce anything earlier, which was odd because it seems like their first big movie is something they still have slated for the summer with Top Gun Maverick. And they left that off, which makes me think they know already ahead of time that they're going to push that off that date and probably push it to like Christmas or something. But they announced for 2 big movies. They announced it for A Quiet Place 2, which has obviously been pushed back forever. I mean, that movie was a couple weeks from opening when the pandemic closed everything last year. And they announced it for Mission Impossible 7, which I believe just wrapped production. So it still has a number of months of post-production left, but this was a new movie that filmed during the pandemic. It's not old pre-pandemic product like a lot of stuff. And what they announced, I think, is going to be very important moving forward. Their theatrical exclusivity window is going to be 45 days for what they think are blockbusters and 30 days for everything else. And the reason I think this is important is because after the pandemic is over, I don't think we're going to go back to the 3-month window that we had before. Mainly because even after theaters are reopened at 100% capacity and product is out there that people want to see and the business starts making money the way it normally does, the theaters are still, I think the estimate I read is that it's going to take them 3 years at that business to finally get back into profit after they have to make up for all of the debt they've accrued since the pandemic happened. So they don't have the leverage to push for the theatrical window to be the 3 months it was before, the 90 days or what have you. So at that point, I think the theaters, without that leverage, are going to try to go to the best deal they have. So what's that best deal? Well, Disney's doing a hodgepodge. We can't really use them as a model for anything. Universal's got 17 days. Now, 17 days makes sense in some ways. Most movies, when they open, they make 50% of whatever they're going to make in theaters in that first weekend. After 3 weekends, most movies are tossed off out of theaters anyway as new product comes in. So most movies they're like 3 weekends and done anyway, if they're lucky, except for the big blockbusters anyway. But also, after 3 weekends, a movie has made close to 90% of what its box office run is going to be for the most part. For most movies, obviously. There's tons of exceptions you can cite. I'm talking about the generality. So it made sense when Universal was doing their model that they'd be, okay, we'll give you your 3 weekends, your 2.5 weeks, and then we're putting it to PVOD. But the thing is, as an audience member, if you know a movie is going to be available to watch at home in 2.5 weeks, are you more inclined to wait and just do it that way? Or if the theatrical window is longer, are you going to be like, well, I want to see it, I don't want to wait that long, I'll just go to the theater anyway? Meaning that even though under the normal model that we had pre-pandemic, 3 weekends was normally how a movie would make it anyway, that audience that would see a movie in 3 weeks, if the window was 3 months, will just wait 3 weeks and see it at home, and thereby the model changes that way. The money distribution changes because those people will just wait. It's a psychological thing, if I only have to wait there and I don't like going to the movies, whatever, then they'll just wait. As opposed to 3 months where it's like, I don't want to wait 3 months to watch this at home. I want to see it now. I'm impatient. I don't want to be spoiled if it's, a big movie or like something like that. And because theaters know that, I don't think they're going to push against that when things are back to normal. And obviously, the same thing goes with the Warner Brothers or the HBO Max model, your day and date with streaming. If they launch on both models at the same day, Some people are just going to be like, well, if I pay $15 a month for HBO Max, why, and I could see however many movies are released from the studio then. Why am I going to go to the theater? And that's that's going to be a lot of people's feelings. So obviously theaters, that's going to be a no-go for them. But Paramount is opening a window open for them that I think theaters can live with. Because if a blockbuster movie is going to have an entire month and a half of exclusivity, then at that point I think a lot of people will just be like, well, I don't want to wait, and then everyone's already going to see it, whatever. And I think that's long enough where the theaters are like, okay, I don't like this, I'd much rather it be longer, but I can live with this. So Paramount, which is probably at this point the most committed to the theatrical experience, because what they seem to have done throughout the pandemic is anything they know is really going to make them money, they're just pushing back. They're not doing anything else with them. So Top Gun pushed back, Quiet Place pushed back. Anything they were like, this was kind of a movie we were expecting to make more in the ancillary market anyway, they've sold off. So, they've sold off The Lovebirds and various stuff, and that's gone to a bunch of different streaming services. They don't have like a contract with just one. Probably the biggest thing that I think they were hurt with was Coming to America. So yeah, I think they thought that could have been a big crowd pleaser comedy movie. I mean, obviously it's a sequel to a very beloved 80s comedy, probably one of the first R-rated comedies I saw as a kid. Love that scene where he goes out into the balcony. He's like, yes, fuck you too. But they ended up selling that off for like $100 million to Amazon Prime, and it comes out next week, I think. But that was probably the biggest like potential blockbuster that they've sold off. Everything else they've just kind of pushed back. So Paramount seems like they're the most committed to theatrical, and I think the 30 or 45 days is kind of a lifeline that they're throwing out to them. All of this talk about theatrical windows is really weird when you consider how different it used to be just years ago. Like, growing up, so mostly in like the 90s when I was a kid, the window, I want to say, was close to 6 months, because I would remember a movie would come out, and about 6 months later is when it would drop on VHS for rental only. It was not sell-through. Like, if you wanted to buy a VHS tape after 6 months, it was like $100. That was the rental store price. Like, it would come to sell-through on Laserdisc when Laserdisc became a thing. But I didn't know anybody who had a Laserdisc. Actually, strike that. I believe the parents of one of the guys my mom dated when I was a kid had a Laserdisc player, but they were super fucking expensive, so nobody had Laserdisc. And then you'd have to wait a full year from when the movie was released in theaters to when you could actually buy it on VHS then. Except for a handful. There were a handful of movies that they did release as sell-through at the same time they were first released on VHS, and they were usually like some big blockbuster stuff. Batman '89, I remember that was a sell-through tape that was like, as soon as it hit VHS, you could also buy it. I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, there were a couple of movies like that. I think even like Lethal Weapon or Lethal Weapon 2. Lethal Weapon 2, I want to say. But otherwise, it seemed like the window was 6 months for rental and then 1 year till you could purchase it. And my God, if how things have changed since then. And now we're talking about 30, 45 days might be the new standard moving forward, at least until theaters get leverage to enforce a window that they like. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think the cat's out of the bag, and people are too used to watching movies at home. And, it's kind of funny. I think the reason, aside from the money reason for people not wanting to go to the theater, if you're paying $10, $12, $15 a ticket for an individual ticket to a movie, and you're going with just more than yourself, it can become cost prohibitive. So I understand that reason for people not liking to go to the movies. But what's weird is that in the last couple of years, MoviePass kind of blew that up. When MoviePass was like, hey, give us $10 a month and we'll give you $50 worth of movie tickets, or $300 if you went every day, that business model collapsed. They're making a documentary about MoviePass. I'm very much looking forward to seeing that. But MoviePass did change the industry in a way, which was that now almost every major theater chain, at least pre-COVID, I mean they're all paused now, came up with a subscription pass for their multiple patrons, or their multiple times a month patrons, where you pay a flat fee, and then you can, and with various different changes, AMC's is different from Regal's, is different from Alamo's, is different from Cinemark's and all that stuff. But you pay a flat monthly fee, and you can pretty much see almost as many movies as you want. Some have weekly limits or what have you, or daily limits too. And the theater chains don't care because they barely get any of the ticket price. They make their money off of the concessions and then the snacks they sell you. And it sort of changed that, where if you're someone like me who goes to multiple movies all the time, at that point it does actually become cheaper to do that than to individually pay a rental fee for PVOD or something. But I don't know when those subscription passes will come back. Probably not till things go back to normal. But I understand why before those subscription passes were a thing, people might prefer, for a cost analysis, just staying at home and doing that, or red boxing or what have you. But the other reason is other people. It's the Jean Paul Sartre hell is other people thing, where you go to a movie, and this has happened to everybody. Some people have had it worse than others. I've only had, I want to say, a small single-digit number of movies I've seen have legitimately, for me, been ruined by people talking. But for some other people, it may be worse. But it's other people. They're talking or what have you, and they're just being obnoxious, and that sort of ruins the experience. People are like, I don't want to deal with that. I'll just watch it at home where I can control the environment. And then you have people, mentioning my stepdad at this point. My stepdad used to be like, I want to put my feet up on the chair because I want, if I'm paying this much, I want to feel comfortable like I'm at home. And in my head, I'm like, well, no, the theater is supposed to be better than home. That's why you go to it. And arguably, people have expensive televisions and sound systems and projectors. So some people might argue that their setup is better than the theater, and I'm not going to argue that. But for the most part, people can't afford to make their home an actual theater experience, because theaters are very costly to maintain. But I think people ruining that experience is what has thrown a lot of people. It's like, I don't want to pay all this money, and then some Yahoo who can't shut the fuck up for 90 minutes ends up ruining it. And I understand that, but as someone who sees, pre-pandemic, as someone who sees hundreds of movies a year, the fact that I've only had movies ruined a single-digit number of times in my entire life makes me think that the problem might be a bit overblown. And some of it might just depend on, when you choose to go see a movie, if you see it on a crowded night, or if you see it in an afternoon, or where you sit, if you sit in a section closer to the screen versus in the back, or what have you. So I think there's other things you can control, where even if there are assholes talking to the theater, you might not even hear them because of where you're sitting, or what have you. Or obviously if you go on a packed Friday night, or if you go to a super late show for a horror movie, or if you see any PG-13 horror movie on a Friday night. I know that from when I worked at theaters. There's ways you can choose your movie-going experience to avoid that sort of terrible element of people who deserve the death penalty for talking during movies. But I understand that that's thrown people away. So there's a lot of factors that are taking, even pre-COVID, there are a lot of factors that were contributing to movie theaters getting a smaller and smaller slice of the pie. And the fear, obviously, is that the exclusivity window, which is the one thing they had, it's like, yeah, you would see it at home if you fucking could, but you can't because we have it for 3 months, so if you want to see it now, you got to see it with me. And that going out the window. I don't know, it makes me long for a time I never experienced. Because, fun little movie history here, when movie theaters first became a thing, which is, when you had big movie palaces, we're talking 1920s pretty much, going to the movie theater was similar to going, what today would be going to a Broadway play. There was no eating or drinking in the auditorium, people got dressed up, and it was sort of a big experience, even though obviously the cost is not the same, because Broadway is prohibitively expensive for a lot of people, and in the 1920s, and even obviously in the Depression and stuff, movies were a lot more accessible. But it also became an all-day event. You'd see 2 movies, there'd be a news short, a cartoon, you go to the flicker shows a whole day, and it's not like that anymore. And then people, as time went on, I mean, snacks or concessions were introduced kind of like a Depression thing. And because people, when they didn't allow food in auditoriums, people, like people with like hot dog and nut carts and all that stuff, they would just sell them outside the theater and people would sneak them in anyway, so the more things changed, the more they stay the same. So finally, theaters were like, hey, this is a separate set of revenue, and they sort of caved to it. And then during the Depression, there were sugar rations, so they couldn't really sell candy, and that's how popcorn became a thing, because corn is, America's like big fucking crop. So they had ready access to this when there were sugar rations. That's how popcorn became a snack, and so on. But you didn't come here for a super old history lesson. I'm just saying that I wish the theatrical experience were held up on the pedestal that a lot of movie fans like myself put it on, and that it weren't considered, living room 2 electric boogaloo like a lot of people consider it, and that probably contributes to why people feel like they can talk, because I assume most troglodytes don't care about the cinema. If they're watching a movie at home, they're probably they're scrolling through their fucking phone, not paying attention to it. They're like, oh yeah, I know it's a visual medium, but if I hear what's happening, I know what's actually going on. Why am I miming a phone when I have my phone here? But they're like, yeah, it's a TikTok thing. What? Who died? What? That's how fucking assholes watch movies at home. And people would just talk freely, so people think like, oh, well, if I watch movies at home doing that, I can do that in this public place doing it, and they're not. I mean, the good thing about one of the small silver linings about the pandemic is that the people who are going to the movies right now seem to be the people who are like myself, and if you're watching my videos, it's probably you as well, the people who really care for the theatrical experience. So in most of those theaters, you can't hear a peep unless it's a comedy, and people are laughing. Where it is, the pandemic crowds have been the most respectful crowds. Aside from, they weren't bad, but when I saw Wonder Woman 1984, I didn't see that at Alamo. I saw that at a Regal, an AMC rather. Regal's closed. And so that one was a little bit more average person-y. But every other movie, except for like the first movies that I saw when they were still closed in my state, people have kept their masks on the whole time unless they were eating and they were putting them immediately back on. Everyone was very silent and very respectful and all of that stuff. So the audiences have been pretty well. I mean, when I did go see New Mutants, there were some annoying kids in the front, so we ended up moving to the back, and I usually sit in the front, but aside from that, it was fine, and that movie sucked anyway. So, I mean, at least there's that. As things go back to normal, you're probably going to get more normal audiences coming in, so some of the annoying riffraff will still be there, but, you can't control that, unfortunately. I mean, I do go to Alamo, which has the strict no talking policy, but they don't always enforce that even when you complain, unfortunately. So, you take what you can. But that was just kind of what I wanted to talk about this week. Was I think if Paramount is offering 30 days for a normal movie and 45 days for a blockbuster, I think the theaters are going to eat that up, and they're going to be like, hey, Universal, Disney, Warner Brothers, this is what we want. If Paramount is going to give us all of their product at this window, we're going to take it, and if you don't match it, we won't take it. And even though they don't really have the leverage, I think the other studios might be like, all right, we can wait 30 days, we can wait 45 days before we put this on PVOD or whatever. And then there are some movies, if it's a smaller movie, these studios might be like, this will just go streaming, and maybe we'll four-wall some of the other movies. That was one thing I wanted to talk about. So last weekend, Nomad was in theaters, and something that's been happening a lot, I think I talked about it a little bit with Wonder Woman, is that the studios aren't being completely clear about their box office grosses right now, and their stated reason is that they don't want people to view whether a movie is successful or a bomb based on their box office numbers right now, because it's not historically comparable to pre-pandemic stuff. But I still feel like they should be, for various reasons, for various transparency and historical, and I'm sure the stockholders of these companies would like to know that too. So it was just an estimate, really a kind of a guesstimate more than an estimate, really, of what this movie made last weekend, and they're estimating about $500,000. And some people had been comparing this to be like, oh, well, Netflix, they occasionally put one of their movies in theaters for an Oscar qualifying run, and they never release it. They never release their box office. But it's not apples to apples there. It's apples to oranges, because when Warner Brothers is putting out Wonder Woman and Little Things and stuff like that, and when Searchlight Disney is putting out Nomadland, they're releasing it like a regular movie release. And Netflix doesn't do that. When Netflix puts a movie in theaters, they do what's called forewalling. And if you've ever seen the Netflix movie, Dolomite Is My Name, they kind of give a crash course on what forewalling is. But if you haven't seen that movie, and it's an excellent movie, you should watch it right now if you haven't. Forewalling is when somebody rents out an auditorium, like if you or I were going to rent out a movie theater for any reason. And then they invite people to the screening. They'll still pull up showtimes for the most part if it's Alamo or something. And then the theater chain gets the rental fee for the auditorium. Whoever rented the auditorium gets 100% of the ticket revenue that they sell. And then the theater chain still gets 100% of their concessions. So you're basically just renting out a theater and you're charging tickets for it. And then the movie theater, they just get a flat fee for your rental, and they get their concessions, and that's it. So it's slightly different, because if the average person does that, they don't put the show times. The average person who rents it has to advertise their own movie screening and all that stuff. Whereas when Netflix does it, the movie theater chains still put up the times like it's a normal movie there. But that's still how Netflix is doing it. So they're not releasing it under the traditional release manner. They're essentially forewalling. So it's a little bit different when you don't release your revenue for that, as opposed to these other movie studios that are doing a normal release under these circumstances. So it's not quite apples to apples, but some people have been claiming, oh, well, Netflix set the precedent for that. It's like, no, they really didn't. They've just been forewalling. And they mostly I want to say the first movie they did that for was Roma. And then since then, they've done a number of other movies. They've done Mank, they've done Irishman, they've done Marriage Story, Dolomite Is My Name. It's usually their Oscar bait stuff. Well, they did put out, for one weekend, and I got to see it at Alamo, they did put out the Breaking Bad Jesse Pinkman epilogue movie, El Camino. So I was happy to see that in the theater, because it was like, hey, now it feels like a Breaking Bad movie and not a Breaking Bad TV show. Because sometimes, I'm getting off into a different topic now, but right now Disney owns Fox, obviously, so they have a Bob's Burgers movie. Now, they could release that, but if you release that directly to somewhere where you watch it on TV, how is that any different from a long episode of that show? Whereas if you take something you normally only see on the small screen and put it on the big screen, then it kind of becomes an event, like the Simpsons movie, or the X-Files movie in 97, or the South Park movie in 99. You take something you're normally used to seeing on television, and then you make it longer and bigger, and you do stuff in the movies that you don't normally do on television because of standards or whatever. Then it becomes special. But if you just take a TV show, make it a movie, and then release that movie direct to VOD or whatever, then it's just, then I'm just paying $20 for 3 episodes, basically. It feels a little different. All right, so this was a bit rambly and not very structured. This is also the second or third time I've attempted to make this video, because I've either gotten phone calls or my cat's been meowing. But I want to make a little thing about, Paramount's thing and Nomadland and the theatrical experience and all that stuff. I did put up polls on my Twitter, which is at David Lennonhawk, and on my YouTube community page. I believe you can only vote on the Twitter one for a day, but the community page, I think, lets views forever, I guess, about what people would prefer their exclusivity window to be, just because I was kind of figuring it out. Like, do people want it to go back to the 3-month? Just as consumers, not even, worrying about whether the theatrical experience will collapse? Do they just like, 30, 45 days is enough? I want to be able to own the Steelbook in a month and a half if I really like the movie. Do they want it 17 days? Just like, fuck it, or do they want HBO Max, which is like, I want to be able to see it at home and theaters at the same time, and then I have the choice kind of thing? Or they don't want to be Disney, where every movie is its own fucking model. You know, we'll charge more for this one. This will go directly to streaming. This will be streaming and charge. This will be... Disney is just... They're just fucking esoteric at this point. Yeah, so that's all I have to say. Have a good one, everybody.